So, are you more of a Mary or a Martha? You knew that question was coming, right? How many times have you been asked that question or asked it of yourself? Anybody ever thought about that question? Yeah, it's one of these things that sometimes you'll go to a retreat or an adult education class, especially a women's retreat. And they'll bring out this text and they'll ask you to identify with either Mary or Martha. Generations of women have been subjected to this question, which has always been posed as an either-or choice. But now, in our enlightened age, men can be put on the spot too with this text. Because after all, women have constantly had to translate stories about men to apply to us. So why shouldn't men, and indeed people of any gender, be asked to imagine themselves into the much smaller number of stories about women in the Bible? Just as the protagonists of Jesus' story about the Good Samaritan, which we read last week, or the confession of Peter, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, or the doubts of Thomas, all have lessons for all Christians. Surely this story about two rivalrous sisters has something to say to all of us as well. Well, I'd like to do something a bit different this morning and invite you to an ancient practice right here during the sermon time, the ancient practice of Lectio Divina. I am going to invite you to become quiet for a few moments and to reread this ancient testimony, this story from Luke that's printed in your bulletin. And Lectio Divina is a way of reading the Bible as a form of prayer, contemplation, or meditation. It's a way to invite the Spirit to give you insight about where this text interacts with your life, not just looking for information about some past age, but how God might be speaking to you today. So right now, I'd like to invite you to take a moment, go back, and reread this story slowly, with spaces, pauses, meditatively, and invite the Spirit to bring these two sisters alive for you. And ask yourself the question, whom do I identify with more? Or are there aspects of each of these two women that I see in myself? So I'll pause for you to be able to do that now. You might ask yourself, what feelings arise for you as you read this text? Do you find yourself wanting to argue back with one of the characters, to offer a defense? So now, I'm going to invite you to respond. We have 2 microphones, one up here and one in the back that Al has, and I would like to invite you to just briefly, if you would like, for people to raise their hands. We will bring a mic to you, and I'd love to hear a phrase, a sentence, a little word from you about what came up for you as you meditated on this text. Anyone? Joanne.
Hello. So my first instinct is always to say, like, Jesus might not have been so dismissive when it came time for supper. It's time to actually eat something. But as I think about it some more, it occurred to me that it might be a parable too about self-care, that Mary, that might have been like her putting on her own oxygen mask first to like sit for a bit and hear what Jesus had to say to her.
Beautiful reflection. Very insightful. Thank you. See, Kath and then Elaine.
When I reread the text just now, I noticed how Martha goes directly to Jesus, and it kind of feels like tattling in a way, rather than, kind of pulling Mary aside and saying, hey, how can we work together on this? And so that might be more of what he was reacting to than, how, because it feels the way she asked, it was kind of like she was setting up a dichotomy that she was better than Mary.
Excellent thoughts. Thank you. Elaine.
Martha is doing traditional women's work, and I don't think she was recognized for that.
Okay. Did you all hear that? Martha was doing traditional women's work, and she wasn't recognized for that. Thank you. And, okay, we're going to go to Leslie and then Margaret. And then I want to invite a man or someone who identifies as male to speak up.
I think that perhaps, is this working? Oh, I think that perhaps Martha didn't understand that she had a choice. And I feel that it's Christ's responsibility to inform her.
So the story, as I read it through, reminded me of, I had several sisters, but being in the kitchen, say, with my sisters and feeling like the one that was supposed to be helping was not doing it. And, of course, we went to the parent and said, Mary's not helping. She's not doing her part. And my mother or father would have reacted very differently from Jesus and would have gotten on Mary's case. You need to go in there and help your sister.
James and then Daniel.
We have one over
Oh,
here.
yeah, go ahead.
I might be duplicating a previous one, but I've been, for example, to home-cooked dinners in Mexico, and it struck me as odd that the women all worked on made the food, and the men all sat in the lounge and smoked cigars. And I felt kind of strange about this. And I'm wondering if Mary was doing something traditionally male in this case, and that might have been what seemed strange. It just occurred to me.
Okay, at first I was really disappointed, kind of disappointed in Jesus reacting that way, but I think it had an important message for our society today, is that we tend to get distracted by all the mundane stuff in life that we have to take care of, and we forget to stop and pay attention to the Lord.
Thank you. Excellent.
Hi, yeah, I have a couple of things I wanted to mention. First, I wanted to just note that it was Martha who welcomed Jesus into her home, and that I don't even know if Mary would have necessarily had the opportunity to sit at Jesus' feet if Martha hadn't done that. But I also think it's notable that Martha goes straight to Jesus to talk about this, the authority figure. Oh, yeah, sorry. And that she didn't approach Mary directly to talk about it instead. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
After your introduction, what was really clear to me was that I was both people. And the issue is, how much time do I put aside the ordinary and mundane in order to feed, as somebody else mentioned, feed myself? And how often do I get distracted by very much more often, by the things that need to be done?
I was just going to say that I really identify with Martha in the sense that I have a propensity to do for my family and create like hospitality and space and be busy. And I think for me in this, what really touched my heart is I miss out on the memories sometimes with the family activities because of the doing nature, and to just remember that we're more than our doing selves, and to take that space of rest and live into those opportunities of growth, rejuvenation, and seize the memories because you only have them for that moment. So that's just really what touched my heart.
I also want to say maybe Martha is distracted and she takes on too many tasks because she doesn't want to be afraid of what happens or how she feels when she goes to Jesus, and she sits at Christ's feet and is with herself.
I think the fact that Mary chose is the basic concern, because Martha didn't seem to choose. She fell into an act, an emotional state, an experience that was quite contrary to the act of choosing. And I think Jesus was interested in emphasizing the value of choice.
Intentionality. Yeah, the importance of intentionality. Bill.
I wonder if the mainline Protestant church is distracted by too much busyness and forgetting the foundation of who we are as a people.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of people might joke that the Catholic Church is more like Mary, and the Protestant Church with our work ethic is a little bit more like Martha. It's a stereotype, but... And committees. Oh, our wonderful committees. Yes. Great. Let's just get two more. Who was back here? I saw somebody's... Oh, yes, Avina. Al, can you take it to Avina? And then Jonathan, who's Daniel's brother, visiting from, is it California? Yes.
From San Diego. The first thought, this is the first time when I've really looked at what are they doing in relationship to Jesus. They both think they're responding to Jesus. Martha is serving Jesus. Mary is listening to Jesus. And I'm going to have to puzzle that.
Great.
We don't know if she was hosting a party or if it was a salon. If it was a salon, I'd be Mary. If I was the hostess of the party, I'd be working.
Oh, all right then. Avina.
For the first time, I noticed in that last line, the better part. And then I thought about, well, what is the part that Martha was missing?
the part was recognizing the presence of the divine in Mary was very immersed in the presence of the divine, and Martha possibly could have been as well if she was present to the divine in front of her.
That is beautiful. Okay, so you know what this means. From now on, you guys get to give my sermon every week. Wonderful, wonderful, rich, deep reflections. Thank you so much. I'm going to have a few more reflections of my own, but really you all covered it all. So I'll share a little bit of my own musings on this text. From the first time I heard this story as a child and as a young person, I always identified with Mary. It probably doesn't surprise you. I never felt like a very good Martha. I've always preferred to be reading or doing something intellectual rather than being in the kitchen or, doing something with my hands. And I've never, ever been a good cook, to my embarrassment, the older I get. And when I was a young girl, I was thrilled to find a story in the Bible where a woman was praised for doing something countercultural, something that was not traditional women's work. And given the choice between Jesus and dishes, I would choose Jesus every time. And in many ways, this has been a bright light for Jesus. People have used this story to justify women going to seminary, even becoming pastors, because sitting at the feet of Jesus was the stance of a disciple. And in a way, people have said this has elevated women to the status of a disciple. But at a certain point, I realized that not everybody feels like me. And over the years, I began to hear that there were lots of people, women and men, who took offense at this passage, and we've heard some of that today, because Jesus is seeming to criticize Martha for doing all this really important work that has to get done for a church or for a household to survive and thrive. And after all, as some of you have said so well, maybe even though Martha was getting distracted and anxious and a little resentful, she probably didn't mean to be choosing dishes over Jesus. She wanted to serve, to make a beautiful meal, to have a beautiful home, and to serve Jesus as her way of showing honor and respect, as her native language of discipleship. So as Elizabeth Johnson says in our modern testimony for today, where would the church be without its Marthas, those faithful folk who perform the tasks of hospitality and service so vital to making the church a welcoming, hospitable place? So at some point along the way, I began to feel guilty. And this is the problem, right? Whenever you pose an either-or question, you feel like you have to be one or the other. And I began to feel guilty that I didn't seem to take as much pleasure as other people did in cooking or even serving food in the food pantry or staying overnight in the homeless shelter. I felt guilty that I was happiest when I was taking a class or teaching a class or preparing or delivering a sermon or simply just talking about faith or life's meaning and purpose with people, rather than doing what seemed to be the real work of keeping body and soul together. And the more and more I realized that we have an incarnational faith, a faith that's all about God's love for our bodies, so much that Jesus became a human being and a human body. I began to realize that I needed to strengthen my Martha muscles. So I began to look for more opportunities to use my hands as well as my head in service to God and neighbor. And I think it's really helped me. It's helped me to exercise my less developed side to become a more well-rounded Christian. And it's also made me much more appreciative of all of you who identify more with Martha. Because I've grown in my appreciation of servant love and servant leadership, of a hands-on faith where actions are more important, more real than words. And I've become more indignant on Martha's behalf. Why is Jesus so hard on her? What about Mary? Wasn't she being just a little selfish and oblivious, maybe downright unsisterly, in just sitting there at Jesus' feet while her sister slaves in the kitchen? Why does Mary get all the credit in this story for choosing the better part? Well, there's some good news for those who find this story troubling, because I think posing the question this way, are you a Martha or a Mary? I think that's a false choice. I think it's not that simple. Remember Jesus' actual words to Martha? Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There's need of only one thing. What's Jesus actually inviting Martha to? Is he inviting her to let go of her service, of her hands-on hospitality? Or, as some of you insightfully pointed out, is he inviting her to release her anxiety, her resentment, her distractedness? Is it possible that the better part, the one thing needful, could be lived out through both Martha's service and Mary's listening and learning? Couldn't both, in different ways, exhibit what both Buddha and Jesus, I believe, taught as one-pointed attention, single-pointed concentration? To be well-rounded Christians, don't we need to develop both our Martha and our Mary sides at some point? As Caroline Lewis, who teaches preaching at Luther Seminary in Minneapolis, writes, when we can think about the both and, we can see that faith is seasonal. There are times for doing and times for listening. There's times for practicing and times for learning. However we choose to describe the discipleship of Martha and Mary, if we're honest, we have all been both, and we need to be both. And there's a lot of possibility in between. Well, over these last few weeks, we have been exploring our First Congregational United Church of Christ covenant in our sermon series. And we were, by the way, able to pin down the date finally. It was adopted in 2009. How many were here in 2009? Yeah. Some, not everybody. It was adopted in the interim period before the church called Anton. And it's a beautiful covenant, and we're revisiting it to explore how it still fits. Is it an old, comfortable shoe? One that still serves us? Or does it need some repairs? Well, the commitment we've been exploring today is the commitment to grow in faith, learning, and service. And I love the fact that this church put the service and the learning together. You see, Mary and Martha together in this one commitment. Because you might say that just as James says faith without works is dead, learning without service is equally dead. But the flip side is also true. And here is where Protestants can struggle. Service without learning, without immersion in prayer and meditation, can also become lifeless. Service without constantly returning to the source, the springs of faith and love which give rise to that service, can burn out and die. As Elizabeth Johnson also says so beautifully in our testimony, listening and doing, receiving God's word and serving others are as vital to the Christian life as inhaling and exhaling are to breathing. We can't be all exhale, all giving away, and no inhaling or receiving. So, at First Congregational United Church of Christ, I invite us to reflect on how we can nurture both of these streams of the faith. How can we nurture the stream of service and the stream of learning? The stream of faith and action and the stream of faith that arises out of a deep spiritual life of prayer and contemplation, or simply resting in the presence of God wherever you find that and however you name God. How can we develop both our Mary and our Martha sides as a congregation? How can we become a community of lifelong learning about what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to be a faithful Christian that's in a world suffering a famine of good news and a drought of love? How can we become a community that more faithfully enacts our values in loving service to the least of these for whom Jesus came? Some thoughts are that you might consider making it a point to get to worship a little early so that you can sit in the quiet and take in the whole prelude, take in the ringing of the bell of mindfulness, take in the silent, pregnant moments for quiet meditation before we get into all the words of the service. Or you might consider joining one of our active ministries, our new immigrant welcoming team, teaching our children through godly play, or teaching adults. We need people that want to lead book studies, teach Bible studies, teach about a topic that inspires you. You might consider adopting our flower bed on the porch, which is very sad, as a way to express our hospitality, love of beauty to the world. You might consider another concrete way to put your faith into action by talking with one of our core ministry facilitators, Karen, Margaret, or Cheryl. What muscles do you feel called to strengthen? What better part is Jesus calling you to embrace? The opportunities and the needs are endless. Our time is not. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? Amen.